Thank you all for coming out for our latest installment. You know, this is a series. We call it the President's Panel on Politics and Policy. We started this about 3 years ago when we felt we needed to come together and talk and understand this changing world. This one I've been looking forward to for quite some time. And by your presence here, I think you're with me on this because I think you read our distinguished guest's words, listen to her on television. You will not be disappointed. You know our guest today is Maggie Haberman, Chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and a CNN political analyst. Quite simply, she is one of the country's most respected journalists and one of the most reliable sources for expert commentary on current events and national issues. She's a veteran political reporter. She's covered City Hall for the New York Daily News, the 2008 presidential campaign and other races for the New York Post, and national affairs for Politico. In 2018, Ms. Haberman and her team at the New York Times won the Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the Trump administration and alleged Russian interference in the 2016 presidential campaign. They also received the Aldo Beckman Award from the White House Correspondents Association. Ms. Haberman has been covering President Trump since he was a real estate developer and businessman in New York. And quite frankly, and you know this, she has access to him that other journalists envy, or perhaps dread, depending on the day. Elle magazine calls Ms. Haberman, quote, maybe the greatest political reporter working today. The Week calls her, I don't know if this is flattering, she'll tell us, a scoop machine. Vanity Fair calls her the Trump whisperer. CNN calls her, quote, one of the best sourced journalists in the game. Please help me welcome Ms. Maggie Haberman. Please. Thank you. So yes, indeed, welcome. I have to start with what I think people want me to ask. We know you've said that President Trump's combative nature with the press is something of a show. Actually, we think you've said that in private, he actually tends to lower the temperature. So I think we'd all be curious about whether that's true, interactions with him. And I know you may not be able to answer this, but why are you the one on his speed dial? Is this born of your years-long connection to him through the New York papers? Please share with us.
To work in reverse order on your questions, I won't get into speaking to him, when or how, but I have, number one, I come from a tabloid background. You highlighted my daily news curriculum vice piece, but actually my time at the New York Post was probably more definitional, and certainly in terms of dealing with him, because the New York Post remains one of his favorite newspapers. It was the paper that helped create the Donald Trump presence through its gossip page, page 6. He had a very transactional relationship with them over many years. So I think that he identifies me with a certain New York culture. And in 2011, when he was, I've dealt with him for a while, including in 2011 when he was sort of pseudo running for president at the time, and that was when he was doing his birther engagement. He, at Politico, which is where I was by then, I was in pretty frequent contact with him and with Michael Cohen and with Roger Stone about, what a campaign was going to look like. And then he ultimately didn't run, and he pulled the plug on it during sweeps week of The Apprentice, which I know was a coincidence. But he, he was. It was all sort of the same players, and in many ways, it was actually the same proto-campaign that he ended up running. So I think he just duration with him counts for a lot. The amount of time you've spent around him. He's often talking about who's been with him for this long, and so he'll say things like, "You were," and he'll say to me, "You were with us, from the beginning." But it's usually in the form of, and so there's no Russia collusion because you never saw Russians around the campaign. So I think that goes to your second question. Ask me your first question again. I'm sorry.
The first question was that we're thinking that you've said that he's got one image in public, but maybe in private he lowers the temperature a little bit.
He does. He does. I mean, it's. So I'd say that the most fundamental thing to understand about Donald Trump is that he actually really hates one-on-one interpersonal conflict. And so the kinds of things that he says about us on Twitter or in interviews or when he's speaking to a crowd, he really will rarely say to you.
He won't say that to you directly.
He has told me when he thinks my coverage is unfair. He has told me when he does not like a story. He has done it in person in the Oval Office. I have a very memorable phone conversation with him about this during the campaign. But it's still not quite as intense as it is when he's on a tear in public, and he likes being around reporters. So I'll give you a for instance, without getting into too many details because much of it was off the record, but there was a swing to Texas a couple of months ago before the midterms. I don't remember what it was for specifically. I think he had a fundraiser and then some quasi-public event. But he had the reporters, and there's 13, I think it is, who are part of the traveling pool, and it changes every day who it is, but I happened to be in the pool that day, and he brought us all up, and Obama never did this, he brought us all up to his cabin. It wasn't just coming back and talking to the reporters, and he did it twice. Both times he was enjoying it so much that they didn't notice when we were landing, and so we were all just sort of sitting there. So, I mean, he likes these engagements. He likes having a captive audience. And he needs the press in ways that I think his supporters don't understand by all of the attacks on the press.
So let me press a little bit more, since you know the president so well. You've said in the past that President Trump frequently lies, but you've also said that he often tells the truth. And you've said that there's not as much strategy behind the lying or truth-telling as some of us might suspect. As I understand it, he's lied to your face in interviews. He's even lied about speaking to you.
True.
Okay, we know that already. So I'm wondering whether this seemingly blind disregard for the truth, whether that changes the way you have to interview him. Has it changed how you interview others? And I'm also curious, and I know this is a three-part question, so I'll be glad to reprise it if I have to. Does he give a signal when he's lying? Does he tip you off, with a wink or something?
It's a very good question. I got asked a version of that actually on TV after, I think one time recently where he lied to my face was when I asked him if he had played a role in his son-in-law getting a security clearance. And I asked him that in an Oval Office interview. In January, he said, "No, I don't even think I have the authority to do that," or something. And I said, "You do have the authority to do it." And he said, "Oh, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't have gotten involved." Some version of, I'm paraphrasing, but I wouldn't have gotten involved. And somebody asked me on CNN, didn't it seem like his voice cadence changed or the octave changed? You didn't
pick it up.
That's a bit too much tea leaf reading for me. I think that, no, I think sometimes when he says things that are not true, he can be extremely convincing. Sometimes when he is saying things that are not true, it can seem as if he's just filibustering to get to the next 10-minute increment of time. In that instance, I will tell you I was very surprised because, just to give you a bit of background on that, I went into that interview, that interview came about in sort of a strange way, and our publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, was present for it because the president had asked him to come to an off-the-record event.
This is the interview about Kushner?
The interview about Kushner. And it was a brief interview. It was a 90-minute. I'd urge all of you to read the transcript because it was actually one of the most interesting interviews, and I'm not about it, nothing to do with us. He just actually was very focused, the president. And it was in many ways one of the most conventional interviews he's done as president. But our publisher was there, and Peter Baker, who is the chief White House correspondent, and I were there, and we were talking on a range of topics. But at that point, I had a tip that there was a memo where John Kelly, a contemporaneous memo, written in 2018, where John Kelly said that he had been either directed or ordered by the president to get Jared Kushner's clearance dealt with. The president, to be clear, has the legal authority to do this. And it's because he has the legal authority to do this that we decided to ask him about it, because we were stuck at that point. We needed to be able to push the story over the line. And I went in assuming he was going to say, yeah, I did. I had the right to do this, and I told John Kelly to do it. And so when I asked the question and the answer that I got was no, I didn't. I was genuinely startled, and I'm not often startled in these things. And it took us a little while longer to actually get confirmation. It was always going to be, I think, a significant fact that the president had ordered a clearance to be delivered because Jared Kushner had these concerns flagged by the FBI and the CIA, but primarily the FBI. But the fact that the president didn't tell the truth about it, I think, made it into a bigger issue. And you had this stark, this was a yes or no question, and most of these are not, and this one was. So there was no signal that he was not telling the truth.
I'm sure he doesn't wink or anything.
I don't know what was going on in his head at that point. And in terms of, I said something on TV once about that he tells the truth. I don't remember what the context was, but it was pretty specific, and it's often tells the truth about what's in his head on certain topics. So, for instance, he will often test something privately with aides. He'll test how something sounds. He'll talk about something he's feeling, and then he'll say it publicly. There's not a ton of hidden inner monologue with him. Like, you usually hear it eventually. I think that's what I meant.
So I think what you're reflecting to us is just your story of the other day that some of you saw. I think it was late last week, perhaps Friday, on the Kushner issue. Mm-hmm. What about this matter of whether this unusual interaction over what's true and what's not true, does that affect you as a journalist with other folks?
It's a really good question. Do you mean in terms of other folks that we cover? Or
yeah.
So this is a pretty unique situation. Yeah. But it's a unique situation that is consistent for him. It existed during the campaign. It existed in 2011. So there's two constants around Donald Trump. And one is you're often going to have a hard time figuring out what's true and what's not. And there will always be at least two, if not more, warring camps or factions. So in 2011, the warring camps were Michael Cohen on one side and Roger Stone and Sam Nunberg on the other. They were the only people in this sort of pseudo-campaign. In 2016, it was Corey Lewandowski versus Paul Manafort. In the White House, it was Steve Bannon versus Jared Kushner. And he likes it. He likes having people vying for the attention of the leader. And so that creates its own problem because each side is shading information in a particular way that makes it harder to know what's true because they're all trying to knife each other in the press. And so that becomes more complicated. During the campaign, what we would do is and this is unusual, reporters generally don't tell each other who their sources are, and I don't believe we should. But for protection, for self-protection, we would talk about it during the campaign, where we were hearing pieces of information from, because it helped inform our understanding of that information. And we would only use information that stacked up. If there was sort of something that was single-sourced, we would cut it out of the story, even if it was something that was a great detail, or even if it was double sourced, if it was coming from a questionable place or a questionable motive, we just felt like we couldn't use it. We had to do this sort of rigorous establishing of the basic facts. That's not typical in the reporting process. We would have to do this sort of this extra layer.
I see.
And we still do, frankly, because there is still this sort of swirl of uncertainty.
Well, you mentioned Michael Cohen a few minutes ago. I'm curious about what your main takeaways were from last week's testimony, and where you think that puts the president in terms of, yes, impeachment, post-presidency indictment. What were your impressions, Maggie?
I'm probably the person who was hearing the least new, just because I'm so immersed in that story. But in terms of the impact I think it had, it was an extraordinary moment. There was not a ton of new information that Michael Cohen provided, just in terms of the broad strokes of what we know and what he has alleged the president did, and what prosecutors have alleged so far in terms of the hush money payments around women claiming affairs with Donald Trump over a decade ago. But just the fact of a former lawyer and fixer on camera, under penalty of perjury, saying all of this about the sitting president, describing him as sort of a gangster, it was dramatic and breathtaking. Now, that said, news moves, the cycles move very quick and fast and hot and then out these days. So I don't know how much of a residue it's going to leave. And Michael Cohen is not a very reliable narrator. There's a reason the prosecutors didn't rely solely on his take on certain things. They looked for other corroborating pieces of evidence because Michael has a history of lying himself. And among the things that Michael pleaded guilty to was lying to Congress about the duration of time that the Trump Tower Moscow project was under discussion during the campaign. I just think it becomes a potential, at minimum it's a roadmap for Congress to look to. It was a bunch of breadcrumbs thrown out there of other names and other people who Congress can try to bring in. And I think you saw that happen yesterday, although I don't think most of this was new information to Jerry Nadler, but you saw him go ahead. He is the head of the Judiciary Committee. 81, I think it was, letters went out to people or entities who might have some connection to this giant sprawling thing that we've been looking at for the last 2 years. The campaign, the business, Facebook, Russia. I mean, it's a whole, the inauguration. I think Michael Cohen provides a roadmap for congressional investigators and prosecutors, and so I think that that's what the significance is. And I think that as much as the president actually stayed calmer about it than I thought he would, just in terms of his tweets, they were not quite as incendiary as I was expecting. There is no way that the president feels comfortable with what took place.
Of course, he blamed his negotiations in North Korea and the outcome on the fact that those hearings occurred.
So it's funny, he is correct that the hearing was scheduled after his trip was announced. He announced the dates for the trip during the State of the Union address. And the fact of the questions being asked about Michael Cohen yelled at the president. I don't know how many of you saw this, but the U.S. media was left out of some key pool event that involved Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un, but the North Korean media was allowed in. And Sarah Sanders, or one of her deputies, said that this was due to sensitivities around these discussions, but it was clearly retaliatory after an AP reporter had shouted a question about Michael Cohen. And so one of Trump's people texted me, because I was disturbed by this. I mean, this is unusual to have a U.S. president in a communist country not defending a free press. George W. Bush did that. Obama did that. I mean, this is just routine. This is standard. I had somebody close to the president text me and say, "Don't you understand that this is bad for him because, he's trying to get a deal right now?" And I knew what they meant was the president felt like he was going to look weak if this question was being shouted to him. And that's how he tends to perceive all of these things. But it's all about him as opposed to the institution of the presidency. So.
So you mentioned Sarah Sanders.
That I did.
I can ask the question.
I can answer all of them.
I'm sure you can.
You're ready.
I mean, I would simply make the observation that it seems to us lay folks, the audience, that the number of on-camera press briefings delivered by her has been dwindling for some months now. And at the same time, the president puts himself on the record using his Twitter feed. How do you deal with the fact that you have no access or limited access to the person that's supposed to be informing us?
You mean that's Sarah Sanders as the person?
Yeah, the
that's been
press
informing us?
secretary.
Right.
We're used to press secretaries being out there a lot.
We are.
Talking about us lay folks.
We are. Yes, I understand that. So I guess I would say a couple of things. Every White House adapts to who the commander-in-chief is. And so the briefings there's not one way that you do the briefings. There's not one way that the press secretary's job is done. It is obviously a bit of an extreme here. Personally, I think that the briefings, I think the briefings are important for the institution. But for this president, those briefings had become, just in terms of what we get out of them, what the public gets out of them, what the press gets out of them, they had become just a form of sort of, it was like intramural football.
It's
like,
combat.
Yeah, but not where you were, it's always adversarial. Always, with every president, the relationship between the media and the president is adversarial. No president likes their media coverage. Bill Clinton still complains about his. President Obama did not like the White House press corps as a whole. George W. Bush had nicknames for people, and so forth and so on. I mean, but this is obviously of a different and singular level, just in terms of the overt hostility. We weren't getting information. We were getting bare-bone talking points by the end. So now what happens is there's no briefing room, and I think it was unfortunate that so many cable networks would play the briefing live every day. That was not typical. That was not typical in previous White Houses.
Wow.
It created the impetus to turn this into a show, both in terms of Sarah Sanders for her boss and reporters who were on air and on camera. Now what happens is White House reporters, there's something called Pebble Beach, which is between the security gate at the White House that reporters come through and the entrance to the West Wing, which is adjacent to the briefing room. And Pebble Beach is where all of the cameras are set up, so that each one has their tent. And so now what happens is that after every morning TV hit, where the TV reporters do their set for the day, they then stake out at a mic stand that's typically right near the West Wing entrance. They stake out either Kellyanne Conway or Sarah Sanders or whoever is going, John Bolton, whoever's going out to speak to the cameras. So it becomes this form of a briefing. But it's 20 minutes, and it's people crouched around, and it's not ideal. But none of this, in terms of the information that we're getting, is ideal. One thing I do want to say: Sarah Sanders, in off camera, is much more helpful than generally speaking, than she is on camera.
Well, that's reassuring.
But it's also a reminder of how much of this is the audience of one playing to what will make Trump happy in terms of the images that he's seeing on television.
Let me turn to your profession for a bit. Why did you choose journalism? Is it a long-time desire? And you might expand a little bit on what I said in terms of what your journey was to the place you're in now.
Sure. So the honest answer is no, I did not choose journalism. I mean, I did technically, but I had never wanted to be a journalist. My father is a journalist, and he was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times for 13 years, I want to say. He was in Tokyo, and then he was in Rome, and then he was in Israel. And my parents are divorced, so we would go there. My brother and I would go 3 months of every year. That was not a great advertisement for what journalism is like for your adult life. So I always wanted to be a writer, but that was not the form I wanted to take. I studied fiction writing at Sarah Lawrence. And then there was this ongoing joke when I went to work for the New York Post, a paper that I love, just to be clear, that, well, the fiction writing comes in handy. But which was an unfair knock. But when I graduated from college, I was bartending at the time. And bartending actually is extremely good training for being a reporter, because
I would have never thought.
You have to sit and make conversation with people. Your livelihood literally depends on it. You're working for tips as a bartender. You're getting a base pay of about $2 an hour. So if you don't get paid tips, you're not going to survive. And so you need to be able to talk to anybody, and you need to be able to approach anybody, and you need to be able to listen to what they're saying. And when the conversation runs dry, you start to ask questions to keep it going. And so it was very, very good training. So I was doing that when I began working at the New York Post, and I took a job as a clerk at the New York Post. It was like $50 a day, $40 a day, because I couldn't get a job at a magazine, which is where I wanted to work. I thought that was a decent bridge between the type of writing I like to do and how you can actually be a professional employed who writes. And I remember the first day at the New York Post thinking, this is not for me. And then the second day, I don't know what happened. It just sort of clicked. I fell in love with the rhythms of the newsroom. It was, the New York tabloids in the 90s were an incredibly exciting place to be. They were interesting. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Paper, but I would strongly advocate watching it. It's one of the great all-time journalism movies. And that's what the environment was like then that I came up in. And I got sent down to City Hall in 1999 to cover Mayor Rudy Giuliani. And he was this larger-than-life figure in New York. He had been a transformative mayor just in terms of crime. He was also a very controversial mayor in terms of his treatment of minorities. And he had this very colorful personal life, but he liked...
Code, yeah.
He liked dealing with the press. He liked holding multiple press conferences a day. He liked jousting. We had tremendous access to him. He was unavoidable for comment almost all the time. And so, but it was very difficult, and he was a brawler, and he would scream at us, and he hated the New York Times. And so there's a lot of familiarity there to current events. In 2001, I was covering Mike Bloomberg's campaign for mayor, and he was well on his way to an epic loss when 9/11 happened. And I was assigned, he won after 9/11 because it just completely reshaped the mayor's race. And I was assigned to cover both him and rebuilding at the Trade Center afterwards. And I worked out of City Hall covering the mayoralty, but also just covering the memorial project, the aftermath for the families, the proposals for rebuilding something at the site that ended up as the tower that's there now, One World Trade Center. In 2010, I was hired by Politico. At that point, I had 3 children. Actually, I was pregnant with the third in 2010. And I covered Mitt Romney's campaign and Obama's campaign. I did a blog with a colleague in 2011, 2012 for Politico. And then I got hired by the Times in 2015. I asked to cover Donald Trump because I needed a clear lane. I needed a beat. And Trump was not somebody who everybody was chomping at the bit to cover. And at that point, he was saying a lot of controversial things very early on. And it was clear that he was going to try to galvanize press attention. My plan for 2016 was that, there would be a campaign, and of course Hillary Clinton was clearly going to win based on all the polls, and I was going to go take a month off and see my kids, and I never got that month off. So
Guess not.
so that's that. And I can't, it's not what I set out to do. It's not what I thought I would be doing when I was a kid, but there's nothing else I could imagine doing with my life. I other than my children, obviously, but professionally, I love what I do. I'm so privileged to do what I do.
So thank you for sharing your personal story in journalism. I'd like to ask some more general questions regarding the profession. we focused a lot of this conversation on President Trump, who screams at the top of his lungs, fake news, fake news. And regardless of what he's doing, that in turn has, I think we'd all agree, gained a considerable amount of attention and traction. How does that affect your ability to do your job? And then if you might expand a bit on the impact this is having, particularly on the print media, which is threatened as it is. The New York Times may not be threatened, but in a city like ours, the paper gets thinner and thinner as one simple metric. Fake news and its consequences, the charge that the news is fake. Can you comment?
I can't. Look, the consequences are dramatic. I'll start globally and then I'll work back locally. But our publisher has twice now, A.G. Sulzberger, said directly to the president, your language is enabling dictators around the globe who use your language as a justification for free press crackdowns. And the president has sort of nodded and appeared to hear it and then moved on and resumed. So he's not going to change, and he's not going to, it's not that he doesn't understand what he's doing at this point, it's that he doesn't care. And so it's not something that is swaying him. So that's the impact is that, for instance, when you have the death of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a columnist, a dissident, a Saudi dissident, and a columnist for the Washington Post, is brutally murdered, allegedly in a Saudi consulate, allegedly by Saudis. And if there's not a clear, bright line drawn, it creates these, inadvertent, perhaps, but it is what it is, permission structures for for people who don't wish for a free press. Locally, look, there are legitimate reasons that people don't trust the news media, and we have done that to ourselves over time. It's not just. So
there have been fake news. Is that what you're saying?
I think that history would bear that out. I think that there have been. I don't like the word fake news because I think it's meaningless at this point. I think that the president's appropriation of the term has rendered it dysfunctional and non-functional. But I do think there certainly have been stories that have either not held up. There have been mistakes that had real consequences, and I think that there are, and I think that the speed of journalism now does not help any of that. Local journalism was already threatened for a variety of reasons. The nationalization of all of these stories, and that's what Trump does, right? Is he nationalizes everything because he turns everything into an up-down referendum on him, which does not help anything locally. I think anytime you have somebody in a position of power who is telling people don't believe what you read, that's not going to help journalism. But it's, I think for many people, especially early on in his administration, it had a real disorienting effect on reporters. Those of us who covered the campaign had gotten used to this. We got used to him saying that, up was down, or that a completely factual story was not true, or that a story involving something that was, witnessed by us was not true. One of Trump's aides said to me, they were saying this about the Access Hollywood tape specifically, but it was a very true point, and I think this goes back to why Michael Cohen testimony mattered so much. In Donald Trump's mind, if something is not on video or audio, or if there's not a photograph, it doesn't exist. Sometimes even if it does, he will find ways around that in terms of what he says, but he's going to try to shade things to his version of events as much as possible for as long as he can. And I think that is part of where the fake news thing is so harmful. He's got this cadre of supporters out there who hear it as a rallying cry.
So how is journalism going to survive?
Same way it has before. I mean, I think that the New York Times will still exist after this president is no longer president. And I think that the trajectory that some local news outlets were on is not necessarily impacted by him. But I think that think everybody just has to buckle up and recognize that the next 2 years and the lead up to his re-election campaign are going to be.
And expand on that a little bit. Clearly, I think we'd all agree, especially those of us who have some age on us, that it's never been like this, that the country has never been as polarized. Is this the new normal?
Yeah,
Or-
I think this is, let me rephrase that. To an extent, I think it's worth remembering that this polarization march began before Donald Trump. But it's important because I think one of the disservices that happens in journalism and in coverage of Trump, and this is a disservice to the readers, is that we tend to treat Trump completely in isolation, as if there's never been anything that has happened before. Everything he does is new. Everything he does is I'm going to mangle this, so I'm not saying it. But everything he does is somehow unique and on its own. And that's just not true. There are actually parts of him that are somewhat reminiscent of Bill Clinton. I don't mean in terms of policy, but just in terms of style. Not at all to the extreme. Donald Trump is not unique, but he is extreme. And so I think it's important to bear in mind. This partisan march began a while ago. It heated up dramatically when Bill Clinton was president. He had a hugely oppositional Republican Congress led by Newt Gingrich. I think that 9/11 and its aftermath did not help. I think that the 2000 election escalated partisan concerns. Trump is an accelerant, but he is not necessarily the origin. But I don't know how we go back. I mean, this is something that I have a lot of conversations about, which is people who Trump's supporters start to act like Trump, but Trump's detractors sometimes act like him too. It's one of the stranger things to watch, is that people who criticize him sometimes emulate him in terms of saying things that are just either not based in fact or that are very hyperbolic. And I think that people need to be mindful that at some point he won't be president, and everyone's going to be left with their own behavior, their own actions. I don't know what the post-Donald Trump world, either in journalism or politically, looks like. I wouldn't even want to venture a guess at this point.
Well, I'll bet that there are many people in this room who would like to ask you questions directly.
Okay.
And I'm sure I'm not going to be disappointed in what I just said. So there are microphones on this side of the room and this side of the room. Please step up and please introduce yourself to Ms. Haberman.
So I would like, from your vantage point, to know what you think the impact on the presidency of Donald Trump is and will be for the long term. Is it irreparably damaged or debased, or is this just a quirk of a personality that we can overcome?
I'm not going to embrace damage or debase just because those are judgments about him that I don't want to make. But I do think that he has consistently pushed to the limit what he can get away with, what power will allow. A Democratic strategist who I know well said to me the day after Trump was elected, people are about to find out how much of our system is norms and not laws. And he was absolutely right. And his point, his prescription for his party at the time was we should pass a laws not norms package. And they didn't do that over the last 2 years. They are getting sort of close to it right now because they're about to vote on this sweeping anti-corruption package. I think it's on Friday in the House. And a lot of the Democrats who won in the midterm elections won on an anti-corruption message. But I think that Trump is going to, for instance, it never would have occurred to anybody, just going back to a basic question you asked, it would not have occurred to previous presidents to just end the briefings. And I think that was as much Sarah Sanders' choice as it was the president's, but there's no other president who would have said, okay, I mentioned, and a lot of this does relate to sort of media treatment, but that's not the only thing. They've been surprisingly prompt at responding to freedom of information requests, and we've noticed this for a while. It has slowed down a bit the longer they've been in office, as opposed to the stuff they were giving us that related to a previous administration. So some things have been consistent, but I don't think we're going to know until afterwards, because it's going to depend on who comes in and what their personality is and what they are going to see as priorities. But what we have seen over the last 2 years is that a lot of what we considered to be the standard of what a president should do has not mattered to this president. And I think that there will be things that for instance, will future presidents release their tax returns? I mean, I assume that the Democratic candidates who are criticizing the president for not doing it will, and I think we heard recently that Bernie Sanders is looking at doing that. He didn't last time. But I think candidates are going to look to get away with as much as possible. I don't know if that answers your question that well, but.
I'm going to take the 2 questions over here, and then you, Dean Tobin, please.
So this one's narrow, but I've been curious about it since some of the op-ed writers were writing it. The view that Trump does not actually lie, that he lacks the ability to think about himself, and that he believes things when he says them.
Who said that?
That the argument is that he's not lying, that he actually believes what he says, and it doesn't matter if he says just the opposite a few minutes later, that he doesn't have the ability to monitor himself, and that he believes what he's saying when he says it.
I think that that may be true sometimes. I think that there are certainly times where he has said things where he seems convinced of them in the moment, even if they're not true. I tried explaining to my colleagues right after the president was elected, my colleague Ashley Parker, then of the Times, now of the Washington Post, and I did a briefing for a pretty stunned Washington, D.C. bureau that had been expecting Hillary Clinton and her team to sweep in as the transition process was beginning. We were trying to explain to them what they needed to understand about the incoming administration. And one of the things that we explained was sometimes he's lying, sometimes he seems to believe it. You're often not going to have any idea which one it is, and ultimately it can't really matter that much. I think that we have all spent a lot of time, myself included, trying to figure out the root of the behavior, and it really doesn't matter. If he's saying something that isn't true, then you have a U.S. president saying something that isn't true. And whether he believes it or not, I think is a good psychological question, not one that I feel like I'm equipped to answer. Look, I'll answer it a different way. On the question about Jared Kushner's clearances, somebody said to me, somebody involved in this process said to me after our story ran, I don't think the president understands the implication of saying that to John Kelly, that yes, just deal with this, or whatever their conversation was, doesn't understand what the order means. That's a strange thing to say. That gets us to a whole other area. If the president doesn't repeatedly understand the implications of what he's doing, it was fine to say that in the first 6 months when he had never been in office before or in government before, but at this point he really should have a sense of it. And so if we're saying that the president doesn't really understand the implication of his actions, I think that raises a whole other set of concerns.
So there's been a lot of speculation about this. I'm wondering if you can comment. Knowing the president as long as you have, do you perceive any changes in his behavior or mental state over the years?
I get asked a version of that a lot. And
This is a health science campus.
I am sure this is a strictly medical question. No, the short answer is no. I mean, somebody once asked me, you know, what's different than what you expected? You know, how is he different than you thought he would be as president? He's exactly who I thought he was as president. If you paid attention to the campaign, there should be very little that surprises you here. He's who he was in 2011. He's almost 10 years older, and that's not insignificant. He's not a guy who exercises regularly, as far as we know. He's not a guy who watches his diet. You know, he likes hamburgers, and I mean, he talks about this pretty openly. But I don't. There's this sort of constant focus on the idea that there's some degeneration going on. And I just don't see that. I think he's who he is and who he's always been.
Thank you.
Sure.
Now, I said this was a health science campus, but it's not exclusively a health science campus. So I want to introduce you to our law school dean.
Beautiful lead up. That was good.
And I want to talk about one of our law school graduates, which is Baltimore's son, Congressman Cummings, and the interaction with his new committee and the president. And, you know, in other presidencies, we might have thought that was meaningful, the fact that there was subpoena authority and someone to take some kind of look into what was happening. And he seems to be a great person to be able to accomplish that. But it's not clear under this president whether the rules will be the same. So if you have any thoughts about either Congressman Cummings' committee and or the committees in the House and how that interaction may play out over the next 2 years.
Sure, I think it's a really good question, and I don't think I have a great answer, although I don't think that it's that the rules aren't going to apply. I think what is going to happen is that the White House is going to stall as long as possible in terms of certain document request responses, and then I think they may force subpoenas to be issued in a bunch of cases. I don't think that the White House is going to defy subpoenas. They might make people go to court, and then it ends up in court. And that would be, I think, different. I think that, as he does with everything else, and as I said before, I think you're going to see a president and a White House who are going to try to test the limits of the power that they have and what they can get away with as long as possible. A lot of this is going to depend on documents, honestly, what Cummings is able to come up with in certain areas, what folks from oversight learned about the clearance process, right? I mean, that relates to the story that we just did. They've been asking questions about that for a while, by the way, and had not gotten documents as far as I know. I think it's just too early to say. I do think that this White House, they've gotten better because they've staffed up a lot in the White House counsel's office, which was pretty depleted by the end of last year. But I don't think that they're quite prepared for the blizzard of paperwork that they're about to find themselves facing, and how much that can grind the gears of their government to a halt, right, or at least a near halt. But I think beyond that, we're not going to know. I think Cummings is a veteran of government, and I think that he understands how this works. So I mean, in that respect, he's if you're somebody who is interested in seeing the results of these investigations, then he's a good person to have there. They're going to do everything they can to avoid turning stuff over. And that is not just the White House, that's also the Trump Organization. That's, I think, a lot of different places. I think they will turn over some things, and then I think on other things they will resist.
Hi, I'm Anjali. I go to University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So my question is about Twitter. As most of you know, politicians, including Donald Trump, have been using Twitter more and more to communicate. And so my question is, how do you think journalists should be covering Trump's tweets as often as they're coming out?
It's an excellent question. I think they should cover them when they're newsworthy, which is different than what happened when he first came into office, which is they were all covered every single time, equally, regardless of actual impact, because this was a new way of seeing a president do this. I mean, Trump made Twitter much more of a central medium for all of us than anyone else had, and Twitter is obviously a pretty young website. I don't think every tweet should be treated the same. I have this thing where I feel like everything with Trump gets treated as if it's or a lot of people, especially the president's critics, think that everything is a four-alarm fire, and every tweet's a four-alarm fire. And if everything is a four-alarm fire, then nothing is a four-alarm fire. Nothing stands out. So I think some of his, is the 17th time he's said witch hunt worth covering the same way that he's done it before, especially when those are his efforts to get headlines saying Trump says witch hunt. I think that there is a misunderstanding of the tweets by some Democrats, which is that it's all a distraction effort. Everything is, and this goes to something that we talked about before about how much is strategy versus not. I mean, some of this is just him riffing. However, some of them are pre-planned tweets. It's not quite the window into his brain that people want to think it is. A lot of times these are workshops with aides, and then they agree to post them. But sometimes it's 10 p.m. and he's just watched Don Lemon, and off goes the tweet. So, and like I said before, you're not always going to know which one it is. So I think you have to just assess based on actual news value, not what you think he's trying to do with it or some kind of game theory. So,
Thank you.
Please, you've been thinking about your question because I know you're making notes.
Hi, I am a journalism professor at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at University of Maryland and a longtime former Sun reporter. I have a question on behalf of my students who are mostly young women. They're first-year students. They all follow you on Twitter. So this is a question about Twitter, but a different question about Twitter. I'm also a mom, so I'm always trying to think about how to protect them, and we've noticed that you get a lot of personal attacks on Twitter, and sometimes you go off Twitter for a while and then come back. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how covering the Trump administration has turned you from a maybe more anonymous reporter to a more public figure that people attribute their own biases or whatever onto you, and how you handle that, and if you have any advice for young people coming up as to how they can handle that.
Terrific.
it's a very thoughtful question. Thank you. I realize that I'm saying this as I'm sitting up here on a stage at an event, but I actually liked my anonymity. So that has been, I just fully accept that that's gone, and that's what it is. But one of the weird things that happens around Trump is that he turns everyone around him into somebody who people know. So like Sean Spicer and the selfies with Sean Spicer, and so that includes the press corps that covers him, because we have become familiar faces. In terms of the hate that I get on Twitter, I'm sure some of it is my fault for imprecise tweets, but I also think that women on the internet face a lot more of it than men do. I think women in general face a lot more of a lot of things than men do. In terms of protecting themselves, I mean, I think about this a lot because I have a 13-year-old who got really into Twitter at one point, and it was hard for me to tell him not to be on it because I'm in a public sphere. And at one point, he tweeted some defense of me when Trump had attacked me. And I got 2 requests from news outlets, can we interview him? And I said, absolutely not. And my son doesn't understand. And he was upset with me that I wouldn't let him do it. And it's hard to explain to kids that this is something that you can't undo, right? That once you take that step in public, you're not going to get the quiet back. So I think honestly, this is going to sound really pat, but the only way to protect yourself is just to not do it. Don't tweet. I mean, there is a school of thought, especially for younger journalists, that you need to be on social media because it helps you expand your network in ways that didn't exist 10 years ago, and that's certainly true. And if you use it that way, it can really help you. If you're using it to attack Amtrak because your train was late, or if you're using it to, offer your opinion on a movie review or on God knows what, or to get in a fight with someone, you're leaving a thumbprint. You're just not going to be able to undo it. I think about this a lot. I'm 45. I cannot imagine growing up with all of this. I think I would have been knocked out of the ring a long time ago. So I just think my only advice is to be judicious, but I think that it's really hard because there is an allure to this online community where there's a discussion happening. I would just ask people so I put something on my phone, and you can, well, you can't see it right now, but what it says is, it's my background screen, and it says, does this need to be done? Does this need to be done by me? And does this need to be done by me right now? And it's my reminder to myself to take my thumb off the trigger sometimes on Twitter. It's going to be a constant battle, I think, for younger folks who are coming up. Thanks.
Let's take your question, and then Michael. Please.
My name is Evan. I'm a student at the University of Maryland School of Social Work, and I had 2 questions. One, you spoke a little bit about, where everything has become global, or everything that's even local has become global. And so there's a lot of stuff that gets lost in the news on a regular basis. For example, the securing funding for the Zadroga bill is just not being covered at all by the news.
No,
Is there some way that those types of things that are just as equally as important as what is going on in terms of, the broader political theater is getting the coverage that it deserves. And my second question is about the president's unique relationship with Fox News. Could you speak a little bit about, just how unusual that is, where, as time goes on, the president's relationship or the media's relationship to the president or to politics in general, to speak to what you said about polarization, that really doesn't help, having what comes across a lot of times as a propaganda outlet, quite honestly.
Those are both great questions. To do the first one first, in terms of matters of importance and how you get attention for them, I think that is what we are all struggling with, and how we don't just kind of follow the herd and go along with whatever. This is my issue with treating every tweet like it's news, right? Like we're just all running in one direction. The Zadroga bill in particular really bothers me, that it's getting so, for those who don't know, this is about funding for 9/11 rescue workers. And it had been such a sacrosanct thing for a long time. It tells you what a distance we have from 9/11. We're almost at the 20th anniversary. So I think some of that is why it's not getting as much attention is, frankly, I think it's just not in the public consciousness the way it was. And I think that's become a reason to focus less on it. It's also, frankly, a product of the death of local media in New York City. It's not what it was at all. The New York Daily News is sort of paying attention to it, but not. Once upon a time, it would have been the front page. At the Post, if the Post was less sort of Trump-focused as it is now, it would have been the front page. Don't think the Times is paying much attention to it. And it's disappointing. I don't have a great answer for that, other than the fact that I think that 9/11 does not resonate with the public the way it once did. There was a great story, I think, in the Journal the other day about, the Wall Street Journal, about how there are now military recruits who were fighting in Afghanistan, who were born after 9/11, right after. That really tells you something about the duration of this war, but also just where we are in this process of recovery as a nation from that event. In terms of Fox, look, Bill Shine is the deputy chief of staff in the White House, and he was a vice president at Fox. He was Roger Ailes' right-hand man. So that was like the pinnacle of the synergy between the two. Rupert Murdoch has always wanted to have an influential relationship with the U.S. president. He is much more overt in his efforts to influence power and to be near power than a lot of moguls are, a lot of media moguls are. And it's interesting, I will say this about Rupert Murdoch, he is the only, now he's not the only, actually, but he's among the only publishers of a newspaper that I've ever worked for who could come into the newsroom and lay out the paper himself. Like, he actually has worked in newspapers and values them, but Fox has become the cash cow. And it has become the voice. It's dangerous, the synergy between the two. There are some really good reporters at Fox News, and they are completely obscured by, the Hannitys of the world and a lot of what gets said on primetime programming. But it's not going to change. It's not going to change because, like I said, Rupert Murdoch wanted this kind of relationship with the U.S. president, but the Bush folks had no use for him. Like, he really wasn't in that inner circle. And Rupert Murdoch privately had thought Trump was sort of a fake prior to the campaign. Jared Kushner helped bring that relationship together in a real way with the current president. And now Rupert Murdoch speaks to the president, almost daily. So I don't think he sees any reason to give that up. But it's, all we can all do is kind of continue talking about it.
Thank you.
Professor?
Hi, Mike Woolley, professor in the School of Social Work. First, thank you for your work.
Thanks.
So my question is, eventually Donald Trump's presidency is going to come to an end. And I'm wondering how you anticipate he may react under there's several ways it could come to an end. But let's say he loses re-election or he gets impeached and removed. How do you think he will behave? How will he react to that? And then also, how do you think the media, society, and our U.S. government will respond under those circumstances?
I mean, they're very different. But a couple of things. I just want to be very clear that I personally do not see, even if he is impeached, I just have a hard time seeing 20 Republican senators, based on the available fact set that we have, voting to remove him from office. And I think that's really important for people to remember. That's what it depends on. Bill Clinton was impeached too, and he saw out his presidency. I think that there is this assumption among Trump's detractors that he will just, and you're getting at this with your question, that he's just going to he'll be gone. You know, he's going to be out of office and then he's gone. He has this, whatever it is, 25%, 30% of the country that is so devoted to him that whatever he says is the truth is the truth. He's going to go hold rallies. He's going to be he has been part of our culture. He's been part of pop culture, been part of media culture for 30 years. He's not just going to walk away and give that up under the circumstances that you just talked about. There is a question, I think there is no question at this point that he runs for re-election, although when I asked him in that interview in the Oval Office in January, if he could see any scenario where he's often talked about I've sacrificed so much, my business has been hurt, and my kids, and whichever day I've done enough, it's not worth it to keep going. And he said, no, I don't see it, meaning that he didn't see himself not running. It was not said with raw conviction, but I still think that he will run, in part because I think he doesn't know how to not, and in part because, and this has been said to me by people close to him, the Southern District of New York, the federal prosecutors that Rudy Giuliani has poked a finger in their eye over and over again, they're running a fine-tooth comb through the Trump organization in a way that has never happened before. And if there is any risk that Trump has some kind of legal exposure, we know that the DOJ guidelines, although Congress doesn't necessarily accept it, but DOJ guidelines are you don't indict a sitting president. So you run for office again and you win, he's safe. I don't think Donald Trump is ever going to go quietly in any scenario. And I do think that everybody who is talking about impeachment kind of casually needs to bear in mind that impeachment is a trauma on the country. That Donald Trump does have people who ardently believe in him and who will see this as an affront to them. So.
Thanks. Let's do your question, and then we'll come over here.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question that relates back to what you talked about in terms of the speed of the current news cycle. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me, or it's reminiscent of triaging patients in the ER. So you take care of them acutely, and you're saving their life, you're fixing what's immediately before you, and then they go off in different units in the hospital, and if you're in the ER, you never find out what happens to the patient. And I wonder if we're losing important threads. For example, the Virginia governor and lieutenant governor story that was, so prominent in the news cycle. Are there still people chasing these potentially important stories down? Or if not, are we losing really important matters because of the focus on the Trump presidency?
It's an excellent question. And I think that it comes up in a lot of ways. I would say that the Virginia example is a little flawed, only because that became the question of, are they going to be, they said they're not going to quit, these politicians. So then the question was, are they going to be removed? And so far the answer appears to be no. And so news outlets are not going to keep covering the same, I used to have an editor at the New York Post who would say it's a newspaper, not an old paper. And so they're going to cover the same story that was established fact already. And there was some terrific local reporting. Virginia still does have some really terrific local outlets. I think that instance that you ask about actually relates more to a previous question about how Trump has changed the presidency. He's changed every office, where I think what everybody has realized that they might be able to do is just stick it out. And if you sort of refuse to acknowledge something or refuse to feed into it or pretend it's not there, and you will not be thrown out of the ring, that things will pass. I mean, that is really what Donald Trump has done, and that's I think we saw that that trickle-down effect most clearly in Virginia. More broadly, in terms of other stories that we're losing and not paying attention to, I actually think the press has done a pretty good job, considering how much there is every day. But this goes back to the whole question of, is every tweet important? No. Is every story of equal significance? No. I think we have all invested a lot of resources in the mechanics of the West Wing and in aspects of the investigations around the president. And I think that without getting into sort of the volume with which those are portrayed sometimes, and I think sometimes it's too loud, but I think those are the important threads.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Please.
Hi, I'm Erin Vignane with the School of Nursing. Shout out to nurses. First of all, I loved you in The Fourth Estate, the HBO documentary.
Thanks.
I wondered how you felt about that. And if you see
it, talk about that all day long.
And if you one see a resurgence in the art of print journalism because of things like that, and because these stories are so much more complex that you can't get them in a soundbite on the same way that you would on broadcast news. And secondly, do you think Trump ever truly wanted to be president? I think that it's been out there that he didn't necessarily expect to win. Do you think he ever really wanted it?
I'll work backwards, and thank
Okay.
you for both of those questions. On the second question about whether he wanted to be president, I once asked somebody, I think it was April or May of 2016, who's very close to the president. I said, does he want to be president, or does he just want to win? And the person said, that's a really good question. And I thought, if the answer is anything other than, of course he wants to be president because he wants to do X, Y, Z, then that is my answer. I think he wanted to win. I don't think he had spent more than a couple hours thinking about what the actual job was like. And again, we have a president who has never served in any office before. He has never been in government. He never ran a campaign before. So just in fairness to him, in fairness to anyone in that kind of a circumstance, you're coming in with such a dearth of knowledge about the basics, right? That he's also not, he's not somebody who likes to read thick briefing books, although he always insists he is, but he isn't. He is somebody who watches a lot of television, although he often says that he's not. Although I would say that the watching a lot of TV thing is a little different than sometimes. We always write it as if it's like he's watching these consecutive hours of TV, just watching like this. TV is often on in the background, and he'll interrupt a conversation and he'll start paying attention to the TV. So it's like it's a continuum. It's not sort of discrete blocks of time or large blocks of time. So I don't know whether he wanted to be president or not. I don't know, but I don't think he had thought a whole lot about what it meant. In terms of the Fourth Estate, I in retrospect, probably would not have cameras in a car where I was texting while I was driving. And when I saw that, I had a heart attack. Not as much as my parents did. But I think that the motive behind doing that was good by the paper, in the sense that I think that was at a time when our processes were really under attack by the president. And it goes back to the whole fake news question that we discussed earlier. And I think that there was a desire by the Times to show how we cover this White House and how we cover any White House. And really there was no, in terms of our approach, there's no difference in terms of how we try to be thoughtful about a story and how we try to get it right and how we deal with sources. I mean, one thing that I do struggle with a lot is there's this question of, should we be doing things differently because Trump is so different? And I still think the basic answer, the fundamental answer is no, in the sense that our processes can't change because of, if anything, they have to just be more cautious and careful, right? So I had an editor say to me during the campaign, I really want to do a photo essay with him. You know, do you think that we could do that? Do you think we could sort of follow him and do that? And I said, I wouldn't put that in an email. Call and ask the question, because what he's going to do is he'll go to the next rally and he'll read the email and say, the New York Times begged me to do this. And so I'm always I'm always thinking in that way that the emails that I send to them are going to be, made public at some point. And I didn't really think about that the same way in the Obama administration. I didn't think about that local government the same way. I had an editor at the New York Post who once said to me when there was an issue involving a source, and he said, their problems are not our problems. And that is fundamentally still the case and always the case in journalism, is that how Donald Trump conducts himself has nothing to do with what we do. And so I think it was important for people to see that. In general, I'm not really that comfortable with us being the story, but I think it's unavoidable in this era.
So a graduate student leader.
Hi, so my name's Ramon. I'm a graduate student here on campus, and I have a bit of a soul-searching question. So,
Mine or yours?
Pretty good.
Okay.
The consumption of news amongst my generation looks very different than it did 20 years, 30 years ago. And a lot of us consume our news through online sources. Some of us are not interested in getting past those paywalls. It looks very different than it did. And my question is, what do you think the future of traditional standard brick and mortar news distributors looks like for us as younger consumers of news? And do terms like fake news sow distrust amongst us younger consumers?
That's a tough question to answer. I don't even want to venture a guess what the future of news is going to look like for consumers your age and younger. I go to my 13-year-old son who consumes news through Apple News for the most part. But that's an aggregator. That's just pulling headlines from different places. I think that everything is going to continue to move very fast and very quick. As I said before, I think fake news is a useless term at this point. But I think that you can probably answer better than I can how you feel about the news that you're consuming. I think that all we can all do is try to be as correct as possible and tune out the noise, which for those of us who write the news is harder and harder. I often lament the death of print journalism, although it's not really dead, but certainly the ailment of print journalism. But in order to change that, it's going to require a lot of funding. So for instance, the president likes to attack Jeff Bezos for owning the Washington Post and suggest that there's some cross-blend of interests, and I understand why he's doing that. But in reality, the best thing that happened to the Washington Post in the last decade was Jeff Bezos, because he pumped money into it. They were able to hire a ton of reporters. They have done tremendous work. Without money, it's going to continue to deteriorate. Yeah. So that said, I don't love this thing where hedge funds come in and buy newspapers. They tend to have less of a news vision. So I don't know yet what the solution is.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ms. Peartree.
Thank you, Dr. Perman. I'm curious, as a veteran of his first campaign, and every indication is he will run again unless something else happens. We certainly have candidates getting into the race now in the other party. What should we be looking for? What should we be paying attention to as this campaign unfolds?
That's an excellent question. So I guess there are a couple of different things. I think that just the broad stroke is that Donald Trump is going to try to do everything he can to keep attention on him, as the story is going to shift toward the Democrats. So I think just be mindful that some of what you're seeing is going to be somebody throwing shiny objects out there to keep your attention. On the Democratic side, I just don't think we're going to have any idea what this field is going to look like in a real way until the first debate. I think people will drop out after the first debate, although we thought that in 2016 on the Republican side, and that didn't happen. So look for that as well, that there just continues to be this huge field. I think that you are going to have, I still don't know who emerges as sort of from the moderate lane. And that I think is a big open question. I think you need to watch for whether Democrats are able to come up with a message, a positive forward-looking message that is somehow not a referendum on Donald Trump. I think some of them are trying to turn it into a choice, not a referendum. And I think you've seen Warren really struggle with that. By struggle, I mean I don't think she has the answer yet. I think watching how candidates handle the smog blanket that is Donald Trump is ultimately going to be what to watch for. But also, there's just a ton of known unknowns of things that could happen. There could be some kind of an attack here or elsewhere that impacts the election. I think you need to be very mindful of fake information floating around. I think that we all have questions about whether what took place in 2016 in terms of stolen documents being disseminated all across the internet, whether that's a harbinger or whether that was a one-off because people have learned. My bet is not that people have learned, so we'll see.
So we have two final questions, and we'll take yours first.
Hi, I'm Shannon Dawkins. I'm Director of University Policy and Procedure. So the Daily, which I listen to daily, which is the New York Times podcast, did a piece on Lindsey Graham this morning.
I saw that, yeah.
So you talked a little bit at the end about holding people accountable with their reactions to sort of extreme behavior by Trump. Do you think that there'll be more pieces like that to talk about Lindsey Graham's behavior in response to Trump, or just holding other politicians accountable generally?
I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I think that, and I was thinking of it less about holding people accountable to their reactions to Trump. I actually was trying to say that I think people need to hold themselves accountable for their own behavior, which means don't just react to Donald Trump the way Donald Trump reacts, because it feels right in that moment. I mean, Lindsey Graham is somebody who has had unique success at going from a Trump mega critic to, you know, somebody who talks to him on a regular basis. I think that unfortunately, I think a lot of the type of coverage that you're asking about is not going to take place until we're further along in history.
Okay, thank you.
And our final question.
No pressure, right?
That'll be good.
As a parent who has children that consume news, how do you teach your kids to vet news stories and sources? What do you tell them to look for, or how do you teach them to do their own research or validation?
It's an excellent question, and it's something that I struggle with literally every day with my son, who in addition to consuming news on Apple News, consumes stuff on Instagram and then reads it back to me. I don't even understand what these sites are that he's looking at, and we look at them, but and he thinks they're anyway. My husband, who's also a journalist, and I have had conversations about how to have a news literacy conversation with our children. Because part of what happens in the Twitter era, where everything moves so fast, is that it leaves like this mental residue, and there's not a full picture, but that's all the people. That's the recall. That's the echo, and then that feels like the whole thing to people. I'm trying to talk to them just about simple things like read the whole story, check the source. These are pretty basic, but because there's so much out there, I feel like I have to drill it into my kids. My 9-year-old is too young. My 8-year-old is too young, but my 13-year-old is super bright and hyper literate, and it's a challenge. He will say things that are basically internet hoaxes to my husband and me, and we're horrified because he's such a bright kid, but he can't really differentiate. And so I think that's been jarring to us to realize that just sort of the things that were sort of second nature growing up to us, that, you know, here are the trustworthy news stories, here's who we read, you know, and there's these 4 papers, and there's these 3 TV stations. It's now a gazillion. I don't have a great answer yet. I'm still figuring it out as we go.
Thank you.
So, as promised, as advertised, fabulous. Maggie